Hi, my name is John Grovender with the Veritas Outbound Product Management Team. In this video, we are going to show you how to configure Single Sign-On, or SSO, using XAML version 2. We'll be connecting to OKTA External Identity Provider, or IDP, version 4 with a NetBackup Primary Server. To make the connection, we'll use SAML to configure NetBackup RBAC groups without domain names. Lastly, we'll cover how we can configure multiple primary servers together with a single OKTA application. That way we don't have to manage individual primary servers from the OKTA IDP side. Here's our primary server with the host name of demo.veritas.com. We'll start the configuration process on this NetBackup primary server. But first, it's critical we verify the host name is the same one configured in its NetBackup client. As always, never assume the commonly known host name of any NetBackup system is being used as the NetBackup client name. DNS aliases or multiple network interfaces might be in use. If a client is configured with a short host name instead of its FQDN or long host name, then we must use the short host name. If this has been configured with the FQDN, then we must use that instead. Here I've logged into my OKTA instance so we can create a new OKTA application integration for connecting to NetBackup primary servers. First I went to the Application tab. Then I clicked on the Create App Integration button. From the protocol options, I select SAML 2.0 protocol. Then I click on Next. I need to give my app a name, so I enter NetBackup Primary Server and click Next. Here's where we use the primary's client name that we verified earlier. I enter the URL shown here for my demonstration primary server and click Next. This is a single signed-on URL on the primary server for callbacks from the NetBackup primary site to OKTA. It's used for the first part of the connection we're making. Since we're configuring just a single primary server, we can copy this URL to the audience URI, also known as the SP Entity ID. The audience URI is known as the audience restriction, and it determines the intended recipient or audience for the SAML assertion. I'll explain how to configure multiple primary servers into this app as the last step. For now, I'm copying the URL for a single primary server into the audience URI. Now we'll enter attribute statements for the NetBackup primary site. We're not going to add any custom values, so the default values we need to enter a user principal name with a member of attribute of app user for our username. For name, I enter user principal name and enter a value for that of appuser.username. For group attribute statements, I enter a name of member of with an unspecified name format, since I don't need to specify one. Then I add a filter of matches regex with a wildcard of .star. That way the user is part of whatever group that will be used. Now I click the Next button. I now identify myself as an OKTA customer with this radio button and then click Finish. We can now review the application I just configured. The next step is to download the OKTA metadata needed by the primary server to connect back to OKTA. To do this, I'll go to the Sign-On tab. By selecting the active SAML certificate, I have a drop-down option to view the IDP metadata. Now we'll go back to the terminal session on the primary server to download the metadata. I had earlier copied the source URL I needed from where I can download the OKTA metadata. I made a target temp folder to receive the data and move my prompt to that folder. In that folder I used the Linux webget or wget command to pull the metadata from the OKTA URL I copied earlier to this folder. Now that I have the metadata copied down to the primary, I can proceed with configuring NetBackup to use it for a connection to OKTA, completing the second half of the connection between OKTA and the primary server. I go to the NetBackup bin folder to run a bpnbat-login command to log into RBAC. RBAC gives me the rights and permissions to run the other commands I need to use. All the commands I'm using are fully described in the NetBackup Commands Guide if you have any detailed questions about the syntax I'm using. For now, I'll just show you the commands with a brief explanation to keep this simple in our demo. Now I'll point NetBackup to the metadata file I downloaded using the NB IDP CMD command shown here. As the name of this command implies, this command adds the OKTA resource described in the metadata to the primary as an IDP resource. The -E switch enables the new IDP resource, and the -CCert switch creates a certificate for it. The SAML key store is updated with this new certificate. I verified that the new IDP was added by listing the configured IDPs by again using the NB IDP CMD command. As with any NetBackup command, all the options for this command can be displayed by running the command with the -help switch. Back in OKTA, we move to the Assignments tab. I've already created a user group called Demo Group for the application we created. Here I'll assign that group to our application and click Done. In the demo group I created, there are 2 users shown here. Here you can see our NetBackup application listed with the other applications. We can now add the demo group users mapped to this application. Now I'll launch the NetBackup web UI and see if I can log in using the new OKTA application. Note that we have the option to log in using single sign-on or SSO. Since SSO is what we're testing, I click that button. Note I'm immediately redirected to the IDP I configured earlier, which is OKTA. I enter one of the usernames I associated with my NetBackup application in OKTA, then the matching password. I'm now prompted to set up OKTA Verify, which is a 2-factor phone security application for OKTA. This is a great example of how an IDP solution can have custom security requirements you'll have to satisfy. NetBackup doesn't use this, but OKTA requires it. I already have Verify installed on my phone, so all I need to do is scan the code shown. Once the code is recognized, the sign-in continues. Hopefully you're not surprised to see the sign-in fail, because we haven't authorized this user access to NetBackup and RBAC yet. I created this error so you can see an example of what an unauthorized IDP user encounters when trying to log in. We'll configure this user next to avoid this error. I have to log in with a non-SSO account recognized by RBAC to complete the configuration. Once in, I go to Security and then RBAC. I'm adding my OKTA-defined user as a SAML user, as shown here. Now I'll sign out and try the SSO sign-in again. I tried the SSO sign-in again, and now I go right in with my demo user. I'm successfully authenticated and authorized to sign into NetBackup. We've successfully added single user OKTA access to NetBackup. Now we will give a group of users access to NetBackup so that we don't have to add users one by one like we just did. I have 2 users in my demo group, and in the real world, I'd be most likely adding a lot more. You probably guessed that we just add the group in RBAC instead of adding individual users, which is correct. However, there are some things you should know about how things have changed between versions when it comes to adding groups. In NetBackup versions before 10.3, SAML groups were required to have a domain name associated with them. That limited SAML group support to only those in X509 certificate format. A domain name had to be bound to each group. Starting with version 10.3, SAML groups can be configured without a domain name. Since OKTA is handling the security, we now assume that any user passed to us by OKTA comes from a legitimate domain. I've added a SAML tracer to my Chrome browser to see how the domain attribute is now handled in 10.3. I'll sign out and back in to capture how the domain issued is now handled in the SAML response. Now that I'm in, I'll check the SAML tracer to see what happened. Under the user principal name, we see that no domain was returned with the user data. We see all the information that was returned here, and yet no domain was returned in any form. Keep in mind that this user is also part of the demo group. Now I'll just add this group instead of the individual users. To prove the group is all I need to sign in. I'll close the SAML tracer and go back to RBAC in the NetBackup Web UI. I remove the demo user from the access list and add the group name instead. I don't need to add the group name in an email format that includes the domain name as in previous versions. I now sign out and sign right back in to test if my group access is working using SSO. See how I can still sign in with my user even though I have not added this SAML user individually to RBAC? The group I added includes this user, so I'm authorized to sign in. I can log in with a demo user 1 that's also in the demo group to further prove this. I'll clear the browser cache so I'm prompted again for the credentials of the new user. Now I'll sign in again using SSO, only this time as demo user 1. I'm prompted again to set up this new user with Verify. Keep in mind that not all IDPs will force you to use two-factor authentication. This requirement will vary with the IDP you're using. I'll have to scan this code to proceed as before, and then SSO should hand me off to RBAC, which will let me sign in. You can see I'm also able to log in with Demo User 1. If we look once again at the SAML tracer for this user, you can see the attributes also contain the same group used for the other user. This user is also part of the demo group, and the email ID of this user is Demo User 1 under the User Principal Name attributes. You've now seen how with NetBackup 10.3 and above you can add RBAC groups without the domain name. Before this version you had to add the SAML groups with the domain name, but that is no longer the case. Moving back to our terminal session, we're going to cover adding additional primary servers using the same OKTA application we configured earlier. This is another feature that wasn't supported until version 10.3. Before this version you had to create separate applications for each primary server, like we just did for the first primary server. Let's quickly look at the configuration settings we entered last time before we modify them for multiple primary servers. As before, we're going to confirm the NetBackup client name of the new primary server to make sure we're going to use the correct client name. The command result shows that the client name of our next primary server is demo1.example.com. Returning to the OKTA interface, we go back to the NetBackup Primary Server application. Selecting Edit, we go back to the General Settings. So here are the settings we used before. My single sign-on URL refers to demo.veritas.com. And likewise the recipient and the destination URLs. Remember that the audience restriction and the SSO Entity ID we used before are critical settings because they focus the connection we made between OKTA and NetBackup entities. We need to add additional primary servers to these settings without disrupting the connection we made with the first primary server. That primary server was demo.veritas.com. So now we will try to reconfigure this application for multiple primary servers using these settings as a starting point. Clicking the Edit button to see the advanced settings, we see that the audience URI stands for the SSO Entity ID. This is a critical configuration point for multiple service providers, in this case primary servers, into a single IDP application. Before NetBackup 10.3, the audience URI was linked to the client's host name, so it wasn't configurable as a URI linked to a primary server. In 10.3 and beyond, the setting isn't bound to the host name, so we can configure it to route to multiple primary servers. In this case, we have another primary server named demo1.example.com. We want to link to this URI. The first trick we're going to use here is changing our URI to any name we want to make up. OKTA just wants a name here, and in this case we're not worried at all if it exists or is even routable. We just need a name here as a placeholder so we can use an advanced feature. This can be anything like abc.com or anything you want that's in URI format. To prove the point, I'll use netbackup.com. We're going to use one of the advanced settings here to add a second primary server. Let's look at those options. The one we're looking for is Other Requestable SSO URLs. In that setting, we click Add Another. We're going to take the single sign-on URL we used before and copy it here, then edit it to match the demo1example.com name for a second primary. The rest of the URL must stay the same. OKTA doesn't care if the new primary's domain name is the same as the other. primary server we already added, but the rest of the URL must be shared amongst all the primary servers we want to add to this application. You can add an index number as an optional short name to identify the new primary if you'd like, but it's not necessary. We've now changed the SP Entity ID and the requestable table of the SSO URLs. We'd repeat this process for any additional primaries that we wanted to add. We click Next and then Finish to save our settings in OKTA. By adding an additional requestable SSO URL, we don't have to manage the second primary server with its own application. We can create just one application, add the first primary, then add additional SSO URLs for additional primaries. Let's review our primary configuration information and then see what happens after adding the additional primary server. Let's try signing on with SSO again. Note the URL I'm signing into is demo.veritas.com. By clicking on Signing in with SSO, I'm redirected to my OKTA IDP. I sign into that as usual using a Verify push notification. The push comes to my device and I accept it. I receive an error that authentication failed. I click on View Details to see what didn't work. Note that an incorrect entity ID is a possible problem, so we need to do a few more steps to clear this error. Going back to our terminal session on our first primary server named Demo, we change to user openv NetBackup bin. We're going to create a JSON file there named datainputfile.json. We edit the file with the SSO Entity ID configuration parameter we need to avoid the error. Note that we must add netbackup.com as a valid URL for sign-ons. We then save and exit the file. I'm using my browser to access the API access URL on the demo primary. This API shows us in the documentation. This API URL shows us the documentation for the valid syntax of various primary security options. The one we're interested in is security properties, specifically the SSO Entity ID parameter. We will do this with the API. Back in my demo terminal session, I'll type out the contents of the JSON file we just made showing the SSO Entity ID domain name we added, netbackup.com. I'm using the nb lib curl command to get a listing of the security parameters from the demo primary. By default, the SSO Entity ID parameter is undefined, or empty. We need to change this parameter to what we configured in our OKTA IDP to avoid the single sign-on error that we ran into. Note that this is a new step for an additional primary we didn't have to do for the first primary. I should also point out that everything you see here with the nb lib curl command is case sensitive and needs to be added with the correct character cases. Let's use the nb live curl command to change the SSO Entity ID parameter to match what we configured in OKTA. You're probably asking yourself why we bothered to create that JSON file with the Entity ID if we must do this step. We're going to configure that empty SSO Entity ID value with the name of our file, so the file has to pre-exist for us to use it. The folder it's in will be used automatically. Our command executes successfully. We can now use our first nb live curl command to verify if the SSO Entity ID change did take place. Let's try to use SSO to sign in again. We should succeed this time because we've configured the Entity ID correctly. We can now sign in successfully. Now let's fix the second primary server, demo1.example.com. That's our next primary server that we are going to perform the single sign-on configuration for. We're going to basically perform all of the non-OKTA steps that we have done for the demo primary server for the demo1 primary server. See how I've been stopped by the same error as before by trying to sign in with SSO. I hadn't configured the SSO Entity ID yet with the nb live curl command. We'll have to fix that as we did before. Let's try using SSO for our sign-in again. This time the authentication should be successful, but we might get the RBAC authorization error on this primary server because this is the other primary server and we have not configured RBAC authorization on this one. We get the SSO error because of RBAC. So I'll log in as the System Security Administrator and fix the RBAC issue. Let's sign in with the SSO again, and we're successful. So now you've seen how NetBackup 10.3 and higher allow you to configure multiple primary servers into a single OKTA IDP application. We also used an RBAC group to allow users to authenticate with SSO without the need to provide a domain name. I'm going to use my terminal session here to type out what was required in versions 10.2 and earlier, so that it's captured in this presentation. Be sure your team knows the differences between pre and post 10.3 versions for configuring this feature. You can still use the old syntax in version 10.3 and higher, but obviously you'd want to use the new domain-free features and syntax. In RBAC, you would use the information that's shown here. That concludes the presentation on how to configure OKTA IDP with multiple NetBackup primary servers using 10.3.